10 awesome obscure 80s horror movies. Hello and welcome to this week's video. Now, as you all know, I love 80s movies and I love horror, and I especially love 80s horror. So this week I thought I'd just do a bit more of a deep dive into, away from some of the more obvious candidates like the sequels and the Halloweens and the Friday the 13th, etc., 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 and take a look at some more obscure 80s movies. Now, I know, one man's obscure is another childhood's favourite. So don't come whining and saying, I've known this movie since I was 7. Well, bully for you. I'm sure there are some movies that I could point to as being childhood favourites that other people have never heard of. I'm talking about movies that I've, for the most part, apart from like the last one, which a lot of people still don't know, these are movies I've only discovered in the last few years. Two, actually, sorry. Anyway, let's get on with it. 1. Bloody Birthday. This 1980 chiller basically focuses on these three little kids. They're unrelated, but they were basically all born during the same solar eclipse. And 10 years later, on their birthday, they suddenly decide to go homicidally insane and start killing people. Bloody Birthday is one I only found last year, or the year before, something like that. Again, never heard of it up until recently. Picked up the Blu-ray and had a bloody good time with it. They're so malevolent, and they're so gleefully malevolent for no reason whatsoever. It's a right laugh. One of them is also Mikey from Parker Lewis Can't Lose, which also made me laugh. Bloody Birthday is a bloody good time. 2. The Appointment. Now, this is a real obscure one that, again, I'd never heard of, and I imagine even some hardcore horror fans have never heard of. This is an early 80s British horror thriller starring Edward Woodward of Callan, The Wicker Man, and The Equalizer fame. Woodward is a middle-aged father who's concerned about upsetting his precocious teenage daughter as he's got to go to some business meeting instead of attending an important concert recital at her school. And he perhaps should be rather worried about upsetting her, especially considering what happened to one of her schoolmates. The Appointment is a really creepy, it's a slow burn, but it is a really creepy and effective little chiller. It's got an arresting opening that then kind of settles into this increasingly unnerving domestic drama. It's like a short story brought to film, and it's really creepy and very unsettling. Even at the end, you're kind of not quite sure what happened. It's very good, and I strongly recommend it. 3. The Budgeons. This is an awesome little early 80s monster movie that, again, I'd never heard of. Apparently for good reason, because apparently it wasn't available on physical media for a really, really long time. So there's no wonder I didn't know it in the 80s. I think I actually first saw this on YouTube. I don't know whether it's still on YouTube. I first watched it on YouTube. I absolutely loved it, and I very quickly went out and got the Blu-ray. The Budgeons is basically about a sealed up mine in a small town in winter. These young miners and their girlfriends are there to do the job and reopen this mine. And of course it was sealed for a reason. There's something buried in there and it gets out. The Woodlands is great 80s horror fun. 4. Madman. Slasher movies were all the rage in the 80s, of course, especially the early 80s, and Madman is from 1981. In fact, it's one of 3 1981 movies that's not just a slasher movie, it's a slasher movie about a madman going crazy on camp counselors. You have Friday the 13th Part 2, I think, and you have The Burning, and then you have this, which is a relatively obscure one. Again, this is one I had never heard of, let alone seen up until a few years ago. It's got a beautiful Blu-ray release with a taken from a 2K restoration, I think. Looks great, and it's really surprisingly good. I really enjoyed Madman. It's got a good cast. Galen Ross from Dawn of the Dead is in it under a different name for some reason, but it's definitely her, and it's very effective. The fact that Is there any other kind of horror movie, or at least slasher movie, that all takes place on the same night? And I mean, not just kind of over the course of one night like Halloween, because that starts in the daytime and then you get to the night. The film starts at night and it all takes place over the course of that one same night, giving it this dark atmosphere throughout the entire film. It's a terrific little horror thriller, a terrific little slasher movie. I strongly recommend it if any slasher fans have not seen it. 5. Curtains. Another strong recommend for horror slasher fans. This is another early 80s one. I think it's about 1983. And again, it's one that was rather lost for a long time. It had a somewhat troubled production with different directors and even a pause in filming for a year, which doesn't exactly bode well. But the end result is surprisingly good. Again, I'd never heard of this movie. Again, I picked it up on Blu-ray. I believe it's a Canadian movie. It's got the great John Vernon in it as a very Harvey Weinstein type movie director who is quote-unquote auditioning actresses at his isolated country retreat. And somebody really wants the part that he's quote-unquote auditioning them for. Someone really wants it, to the point of being willing to kill off their competitors. Curtains is a terrific little chiller. I'm not sure it entirely makes sense, probably because of the troubled production, but it's a very engaging watch. It's also got Linda Thorson from The Avengers, Tara King, if anybody knows what I'm talking about there, and some very effective scenes. The killer wears this old hag mask that is very scary indeed. And there's a murder on ice sequence that is probably the most famous scene in the film that's very, very effective indeed. I really enjoyed Curtains. 6. Wild Beasts. Now, this is an Italian horror film from the mid-80s, about 1984, I think. And it's completely nuts. Basically, what happens is PCP somehow gets into the water supply at a local zoo in a German/Italian city. I'm not entirely sure what it's supposed to be, because I think it was made in Germany or set in Italy or the other way around, but whatever, it's not really important. And the animals go completely nuts. They break out and go nuts, and lots of people get slaughtered. Now, this is made nowadays, of course. It would all be CG and it would be shit. But this is the 80s, so you've got a mixture of real animals and practical effects. And it's fucking awesome. You've got a cheetah chasing after a speeding car. You've got a tiger on a subway train. And you've got a polar bear stalking kids in a school, among many other delights. Wild Beast is off the charts, fucking nuts. And I really, really like it. 7. Link. Now, I have to admit this is a bit more of a favourite of mine, though I'm disappointed to see how little known it is these days. Link has a great cast, including Elizabeth Shue and Terence Stamp. It's basically a killer orangutan movie. It's also directed by Richard Franklin, the very, very underrated, very, very great Richard Franklin, who also did Psycho 2, which should be recommendation enough. Link basically stars Elizabeth Shue as this American anthropology student in the UK who agrees to take on a summer job at the elaborate clifftop home of her eccentric professor, Terence Stamp. Turns out he's even more eccentric than she realises. He's got animals roaming the thing, and has a butler who's an orangutan, a former circus performer called Link, who wears clothes and smokes cigars and does all sorts of things around the house. Unfortunately, Link also has other ideas, and when Stamp goes missing, Shue basically finds herself engaged in a battle of wits with an orangutan with murderous intentions. Link is a terrific comedy horror. My brother basically won this on VHS in the mid to late 80s, and we watched this endlessly. And I watched it again a few years ago on DVD after having not seen it for a couple of decades, and loved it all over again. In fact, it's almost time for another watch. Link is great fun. 8. Miracle Mile. Now, I have to confess, this is another one that I've seen more than others, though I hadn't seen it for decades. In fact, I recently got the Blu-ray, loved it all over again. This kind of, whether is this horror? I think it's horror. It's more sort of nightmare horror than traditional horror. Anthony Edwards of ER fame is a young man who meets the girl of his dreams. He arranges to basically meet her for a date after her evening shift at a diner. Unfortunately, falls asleep and as a result of a power cut in his building, misses the date. He goes down there several hours late, hoping to find her. Unsurprisingly, she's gone. And then the phone booth near the diner starts ringing. You remember phone booths? He makes the rather unwise mistake of picking it up, probably hoping that it's her, and gets a message, a rather garbled message from what appears to be a young soldier telling his father to get out of the city because the missiles are flying and nuclear apocalypse is on its way. Rather increasingly unnerved, Edwards tries to find his girl and get the hell out of the city, but the more people he has to rope into his attempt, the more the panic spreads, and soon the city is descending into chaos, all based around a phone call that may not even be real. Miracle Mile is a paranoid nightmare thriller. It's edge-of-the-seat stuff. You also got Denise Crosby in there in a small role, Star Trek fans. And Mare Winningham from many other 80s movies. Miracle Mile is an absolute cracker of a thriller that really has the feel of a nightmare. If you've never seen it, and many people haven't, sadly, I suggest you go out and see it immediately. 9. The Zero Boys. Again, this is another one I've never heard of up until the last couple of years. The Zero Boys is basically a traditional kind of backwoods slasher, albeit with a little bit of a twist in that the group of young adults who are being targeted by a bunch of backwoods hick serial killers are kind of not just paintballers but survivalists who have real guns, and the serial killers find themselves in for more of a battle than they were expecting. This is a really fun action horror. It's got Kelly Maroney in it, who 80s cult fans will also know from Chopping Mall, which I'm not a particular fan of, I have to admit, and Night of the Comet, which I am a big fan of, I have to admit. The Zero Boys is a lot of fun. I did find the ending to be a little bit on the abrupt side, but it's a great fun ride while it lasts. And again, it's another example of a movie I'd never even heard of. I've always thought of myself as an 80s aficionado, and I'm still finding tons of stuff I've never even heard of before, let alone seen. 10. Anguish. Now, again, this is another one that I have been aware of for a very long time, but again, it's surprisingly many people are not aware of it. Anguish is a late 80s seriously weird psychological slasher pick. That plays with different levels of reality. You've got Michael Lerner and Zelda Rubinstein in it. It's basically a movie about a serial killer who is dominated by his insane mother, who goes out killing people and collecting their eyes. But there's a number of twists to the movie, and there's also a killer running around a cinema killing people. I don't want to give too much away, but Anguish is a hypnotically weird movie and a really entertaining slasher flick with a good sense of humour, and again, really, really weird. So that's it. No, I'm not saying this, and now, again, I'm not saying this is a top 10 obscure. This is just 10 that I either really, really like and think deserve more attention, or I really, really like and I've only discovered recently myself. Everything from Bloody Birthday, The Appointment, The Budgeons, Madman, Curtains, Wild Beasts, Link, Miracle Mile, Zero Boys, and Anguish. These are some awesome 80s horror movies. If you haven't seen them, what's stopping you?